Good afternoon and welcome to our next session. Today we have Humanizing Assessment, Documenting Learning to Move Students from Data Points to Doers. Thank you for joining us today. We are live streaming on YouTube. Please be sure to live chat with us on YouTube or wherever you're watching today. You can find the link to this session's live YouTube page on gathering.TheEdCollab.com. Today, we are so pleased to welcome two amazing speakers. Today, we have Sochi Bentley and Angela Stockman.
Hello. Hey, everyone. We are thrilled to be with you today. When I first read Angela's book, The Writing Teacher's Guide to Pedagogical Documentation, I felt the courage to become more experimental with assessment. And in this book, she offers us this invitation to rethink how we assess learners and learning. And I just fell in love with the idea of learning stories. And when I thought of learning stories, I felt this call to action. And something that I regularly do in my classroom is I ask my students to develop a place-based call to action. So develop a call to action based on a need you identify in a place that you care about, that you know well, that you're getting to know better. And I found that with inviting students to gather artifacts that signal or mark their learning at different steps of that journey was really, really fulfilling, and it made the learning journey memorable. And I just want to talk a little bit about my first experiences with documenting before we hear from Angela about her approach to all this. So what works in my classroom is to use these documenting scrapbooks. And what I love about scrapbooks is, students can choose how to collect artifacts, gather artifacts, refer back to artifacts while they're at different stages of their journey. And I think something that really sticks with me from Angela's book is something she says that documentation makes us more present practitioners. And I love that because I noticed not only were my students in groups, their engagement was heightened, but me as an educator observing them, noticing what they were doing in groups, that it was heightening my ability to notice what was actually working, what wasn't working, and what I could do as next steps to help them with their learning journey. And so I just want to show you some examples of some of the learning artifacts that they chose and they gathered for their scrapbooks. So here you see an early moment in a documentation journey with a scrapbook where a group that was kind of pondering what are those seemingly insurmountable challenges to local conservation efforts. They started to make a list and they added this list to their scrapbook. And something they jotted down was there's just not enough opportunities presented for people to help. And what was a really interesting moment as someone observing is that's when an organic debate arose. Some other group members were like, is that really true? Is there not enough opportunities, or is there just not enough awareness about the opportunities that actually exist? And that was fascinating to me, that rather than me assigning a debate, arbitrarily giving them topics, them quickly deciding upon pros and cons of a topic, this debate arose really organically based on something they put in their scrapbook for documentation. And that was really cool because they were leaning into their uncertainty. It wasn't like, we definitely know this. It was like, let's probe this, let's ponder this together and keep this question with us. And quickly I saw right away that just a really practical aspect of documenting a learning story is you have all these tools, these memory tools. So like anyone, a couple weeks later, or with a couple of student absences, you might forget, what did we talk about last week? But with some ability to document your artifacts, it's pretty easy to refer back to and to get that entry point once again. Something else that they included in this particular scrapbook is a shift. And what's really fascinating is when students notice a shift in their thinking. So they notice a shift from this broad question of how can we protect the environment to how can we get others to actually act. And that's really fascinating to me, where I don't have to point out shifts, but students are pointing out the turns and the plot twists in their thinking. And so this was a springboard to a whole new conversation where the student group was talking about, okay, so what does that mean to engage people outside this classroom? Like, do we need to think about messaging and messaging targets and the role of communication and what actually would be good communication strategies? And is that different depending on the audience we're pitching to? So all of a sudden, the outreach and the ability to develop advocacy messages became more nuanced. What's really, really fascinating about documenting learning journeys is in their choosing of artifacts, when you see students going beyond kind of simplistic binary thinking, like it's either this or it's that. And so one way that I think is really important is with the idea of like, what is data itself? And so I think that it may be easy to think like, gosh, we're really going to pour over like the so-called hard data and look at quantitative data and download a lot of information from data dashboards. Um, but with documenting a learning journey through this opportunity, I noticed that students realize just one piece of data is not the whole story of this topic. So you might download some information, really credible information about how a healthcare system is being responsive to community needs. But if you actually interview a group of people that have firsthand experience with this topic, you might find some evidence to suggest otherwise. And that tension between what the so-called hard data and the soft data is providing is really interesting, because you see that students are developing experience and agility with sifting through data sources and synthesizing data sources, and see where they meet, where there's common ground, and also finding out where there's dissonance. But in any case, students are seeing the value of a variety of different data types, which is so important because it offers, more nuance in their perspective taking. I just wanted to zoom in on some examples that I thought were really, really fantastic. So one student was in a group where she and her group members were thinking about overconsumption, specifically with fashion and fast fashion. And part of what she included in the form of a personal reflection in a scrapbook was her participation, her delight in outfit of the day trends, particularly how it happens on social media. And she says, my whole life I've been passionate about fashion, but what I'm realizing the longer we think about this topic together, I'm having this experience emotionally where I want to be proud of how I participate in fashion trends, but I'm also starting to feel guilty, and I'm trying to navigate that. And I thought that was really interesting because she herself was noticing this reinforcing feedback loop where, we chase media or micro trends that signals to companies there's high consumer demand. And there that hastens, the manufacturer quickly producing more fast fashion that's not ethically produced or sustainable. And thus the loop begins again. And so part of her journey and her reflection was thinking about, I want to have values aligned with my habits. And so I'm going to focus more on ways I can engage in thrift shopping, ways I can wear clothing I've found from my family members, and ways I might engage in upcycling. And so it was really, really interesting how she thought about how to interrupt behaviors and how to interrupt mindsets herself. Something that I noticed with a lot of student groups that was so illuminating to them was how they created surveys to find out perceptions about a topic they were scrutinizing and what they did with those survey results. And so, one very memorable example is students created a survey that they each shot out to like 15 people, and it was about food label literacy. And what they were seeking to find out was very different from how the folks interpreted their questions on the survey. So when they were talking about food label literacy, they were thinking about like food expiration dates and like what do you understand about use by, best of use by, sell by. Like they wanted to know what people thought about what is that safe window in which food can be enjoyed. But instead, the survey respondents were really thinking about food label literacy as, oh, nutritional information that informs my healthy decision making about what I eat, what was really not the focus of their investigation. So that was really illuminating, right? Like there's a bit of a gap here with what we thought we were going to find out about and what we actually ended up finding out about. But that provoked a whole new group of questions like, well, wait, when we think about like expiration dates on food labels, do we really have formal collective opportunities in life to think about expiration dates? And this was really interesting because it made us think about what opportunities exist in schools or outside schools to learn about this. And you know, their whole goal was to bring attention to this because so much food is thrown out too early, thus contributing to an overabundance of things in landfills, thus contributing to a lot of methane in the atmosphere. But the way their questions were interpreted just were illuminating in a different way. And that is something I love about documenting a learning journey. The twists and turns are not necessarily what you expect to happen, but what happens is illuminating in a wholly different way that's really, really helpful. And based on how students were really talking about the gaps between what was happening with survey creation and results, that helped me as the teacher that was witnessing and observing and documenting herself to think about what sort of helpful protocol could I give. So something that I helped students, particularly students that were new to documenting or even how to norm behaviors around group projects, was like, what's some protocol for looking at our surveys together? Like what are the common denominators in the responses? What might be some outliers? What's confusing about the survey respondents? But also like what is not captured in the survey responses? Like what's still missing here? And having students have an opportunity to practice making that inference is really helpful as well. There's still digging to be done. There's still research that can still be done on this topic. It's also really valuable with scrapbooks is having students chart themselves where they might have focused on one solution and then realized there was an opportunity to multi-solve. And so, for example, in the case of this group, they were really thinking about, you know, the spread of misinformation and disinformation is so harmful. You know, how can we combat this and what can we do? Like, what's a really good intervention for this problem? And so at first they're thinking about, well, let's create some sort of awareness campaign or presentation. And then one group member said, well, wait a minute, like if we go to a specific audience, though, there might be a bigger lift here and like what they interpret as like the ability to solve multiple problems at once. So the example was, let's go to a school district school board and talk about how we see that you are talking about media literacy as being really important. How can we use your focus on that and combine that with targeted efforts with your focus on sustainability and social emotional learning? So their example was, let's talk to some school district representative and talk about how we can use greenwashing, an example of misinformation or disinformation that targets sustainability efforts, but also targets students' feelings of discomfort and fear associated with climate change. And so having this ability with the use of artifacts to then multi-solve was really, really interesting. And then lastly, something I just wanted to share out from what I noticed with these initial forays with documenting is how documenting and getting more into that learning journey expands our view of community assets. And so, you know, I have a lot of experience with giving students mentor texts for, say, here is a set of mentor texts of editorials that can help you figure out how to structure an editorial, or here's a set of mentor texts in the form of book reviews. This will give you some ideas about how to formulate a book review. But the idea of giving students maps and the way assets are mapped in community, this was different for me and really, really fruitful. So I gave an example of how in New York City, the Audubon Society is mapping the depiction of bird murals on different buildings throughout all the neighborhoods. And the goal of this bird mural project is to suggest that there are 389 birds at risk of extinction due to climate change. And so you found that in all these neighborhoods in New York City, people were purposely visiting all the murals, finding out more about these birds, and thus contributing or focusing on local conservation efforts.
Mm.
And what my student did with that example as a mentor text is she created a map in LA County of different places you could thrift or upcycle your clothing that you might not have been aware of, even though you're a resident in this area your whole life. And so you see this opportunity with artifacts to kind of defamiliarize the familiar, that which you knew so well, you see with new eyes. And I just thought that was fascinating. I want to turn to Angela though, because now that you've seen my attempts, I want us to really hear from her thoughts.
Yeah. So Sochi can tell you that I first became really compelled with her work when I had the opportunity to meet her when I was visiting California years ago. I live in New York on the other side of the country. And I remember sitting over dinner with her, and she was explaining the new book that she was writing. And it was called Helping Students Become Climate Stewards Through Storytelling, for environmental agency and advocacy work and problem solving. And there's a word that keeps winding its way through today's conversation that I really want to center on, and that word is fear. And the reason why I was so compelled by Sochi's work and her take on inspiring students to really understand and care about the environment more is that she spoke to me about how stories can reduce our fear. And that if we could invite story making and telling around the environment, we might be able to engage learners more. And it just resonated with me so deeply, and it made so much sense. And it also kind of reverberated through my own documentation work. I years ago started a little writing studio in Buffalo, New York, where I live. And I started that studio because I've worked in schools for over 30 years now as someone who does literacy work. And a lot of what I'm often hired to do is to kind of move the needle on performance. And what I was finding was that if we could step out of school into a third space where we could really just study writing and writers, we might be able to learn something that we struggle to when we're in schools. And I remember my friend Michelle, who is a teacher in Kenton Central School District. She was one of the first teachers in my studio to say, I've had it with these spreadsheets. I absolutely want to improve performance on our standardized assessments, and I want them to perform well in my classroom on my local tests and quizzes too. But I cannot get out from under the weight of these numbers. They're sturdy and solid, and they create all sorts of really foolish confidence, quite honestly. So we started brainstorming, and to this day, I carry a scrapbook with me everywhere. That year, Michelle and I started using sketchbooks, and she would take pictures of her students writing over their shoulders, and she would start to notice patterns. And we could put it all on a spread across 2 pages in a notebook, and those sticky notes are her reflections. I still live like this every day. The scrapbook has become a really essential part of the learning and work that we do. And what's so fascinating to me is it is a deeply satisfying way for teachers to begin noticing trends and patterns. And we don't have to bring learning to a halt to do that anymore, to test or quiz. I do a lot of work around standards-based grading and reporting. And if we have a standard of any kind in our head, even if it's our personal standard, we can start looking for evidence of that and inviting students to capture pictures and to reflect. And that very human evidence of learning actually helps us get under the hood of that quantitative data. It helps to explain why learners might be performing the way that they are. And so the scrapbook has this incredibly human feel. And if you want to advance the slides to the next one, and it really cultivated curiosity for Michelle. This work with documentation, it also expands our identity capital. I started to realize that, we're far more than what our title or our role might suggest. When we start keeping these stories and building them ourselves and with other children, we start to notice things about ourselves that we wouldn't have otherwise. And this was the case with my friend Jackie James Creedon, who is one of the people that I admire most in the world because she took down a factory 3 blocks from my house that was poisoning all of us. And she did that through a grassroots campaign where they were using buckets to do soil and sampling. And she won an EPA award for that. And Jackie has never, felt comfortable as a writer herself, but she began documenting her learning, and we began noticing patterns and trends. And she began to notice themes emerging that are now part of a children's book that she's writing about how she is a steward of our environment. And so when I met Sochi and we started talking about documentation, this gorgeous tapestry of experiences sort of began unfolding in my own life. Documentation isn't just for learners and it isn't just for teachers. It is really something that helps us notice and dignify our learning experiences in all sorts of settings. When we document our learning, it intensifies those experiences and it makes us much more present. If you want to advance to the next one, that would be great. And I wanted to land here. And one of the reasons why we're sharing the slide deck with you is there's a video here that I would love for you to take a peek at when you're on your own. I have the opportunity to work in just a handful of schools long term for years and years and years. And one of them is West Valley Central School District, which is a rural district here in New York State. I've worked there for almost 7 years now. And K-12 teachers, they keep these scrapbooks too. And we build documentation panels together. And we've actually created a scrapbook that is a collaborative scrapbook. All of our documentation is attentive to needs that our standardized assessment data and other quantitative measures have suggested are important. But for instance, if we know that learners seem to be struggling to identify main idea or to produce one, if there's a lot of quantitative evidence of that from standardized tests and local assessments, and no matter how often we've given those tests, or who the students are, or whether there happens to be a global pandemic going on or not, that seems to be an issue showing up in that set of data over and over again. We don't want to ignore that, but we got curious about it. And so teachers were just simply asked to go into their classrooms and study. How do you teach that? How are you assessing it? What are you noticing about students when you do it? What are they telling you about what's easy, what's hard? And just as Sochi was explaining, once they start documenting, your questions become better. You get curious about nuances. What you're studying becomes a little bit more precise and attuned to everything that you're learning. The video that you're going to see in this particular slide is going to give you a peek into what it's looked like to document learning in West Valley over the last 7 years, where we've also seen at some levels a pretty significant lift in performance on standardized assessments. And more importantly, there's a huge lift in morale as well. One of my favorite memories of working in this particular system was when I arrived early one morning. We start usually at 7:30 there. It's dark and it was winter. And I was walking down the hall toward the room that we would be working in that day. And when I came in the door, teachers were already there. at 7:15. They had coffee and the lights were a little bit low, and they were flipping through that scrapbook, and they were remembering our learning stories. And what they were remembering didn't come from a spreadsheet. It came from the documented evidence, photos, and student reflections and student work samples that you'll see in that video that were a part of our journey together. The biggest challenge that I face in this work is helping administrators who are very much about the numbers understand that if you don't move in this way, you will never understand why students are performing that way. Documentation helps us get under the hood of quantitative data. It helps us develop a much more sophisticated perspective about what might be happening too. So my greatest hope is that people like Sochi and some of you who might be listening today, that you'll all kind of stay in touch, that you'll continue good work and conversation around how we might use qualitative evidence of learning. There's so many people championing this in the field, people that I admire, people that are doing this work in very different sorts of ways, using very different sorts of tools. And yes, technology is very useful here too, but there is nothing like having a scrapbook. And so if you're wondering, I love to get together, open my scrapbook beside other teachers who are studying the same thing, and we tell our stories and we audio record them using a speech to text app. It produces a transcript. Those transcripts are very easy to notice patterns in now. And so it's possible to create quantitative evidence of learning from the stories that we capture in our scrapbooks. And that data is very persuasive for those people that are not satisfied by the scrapbook and they need to see the numbers. It's very easy to produce them now if you need to, and I hope that you don't always do. I'm really grateful to all of you for hanging out with us today, and Sochi and I want to remind you that you can stay in touch with us. I'm easy to find online. If you just Google my name, Angela Stockman, you'll find me in a lot of different places. Sochi, where can they find you if they have questions?
Instagram, Blue Sky, my personal website.
Yeah. And both of us have kind of unique names in the field, so they're not other people that carry our names as well. So we hope you'll reach out and stay in touch. We're happy to share more too. And we hope that you will pay the joy forward today as well by making a donation to any one of the different organizations that are being held up today, which are all really, really worthy places. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you both for that wonderful session about the power of documentation and the impact not only in the classroom, but really on the world. Those examples were very inspiring. And I know if anybody else is like me, they were frantically jotting down ideas and resources. So thank you so much. And thank you for sharing your slides. The link is in the chat as well. So thank you so much to our presenters for today. Coming up next, we have our closing remarks from our founding director, Christopher Lehman. You can, as Angela plugged, you can, if you feel inspired by this session, you can please visit our charity page to pay the joy forward. But as I said before, coming up next, we have our closing remarks from Christopher Lehman. You can get the link there for this session at gathering.theedcollab.com. Thank you.